Nick, welcome.
Thanks.
A firefighter and a registered psychotherapist, all
Yeah.
in one right here.
Mixed bag.
Wow.
Yeah.
Apparently an author as well.
Yeah. So I've written a book, like a small booklet. So it's a first responder mental health awareness for first responders and their families. I also write pretty regularly for Firefighting Canada and Canadian Firefighter, in international magazines and national as well. On topics of mental health.
We always hear about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a lot more than just PTSD.
Yeah.
Can you go into what is a lot more other than PTSD?
Yeah, I think that, PTSD is like the worst case scenario when it comes to our mental health. And we've had a lot of push and awareness since 2016 when the presumptive legislation came in. But also, especially what I experience a lot of is first responders coming through saying they have PTSD or they think they have PTSD. And when we get in, they've got extreme anxiety and they're having panic attacks, or they're having a normal stress response and they're experiencing nightmares and flashbacks and all these things that are scary and uncomfortable, but are pretty normal stress responses within a time limit. So right after the event, for instance. So after the call has always been predicated on this idea that we're looking at the entire mental health spectrum for all first responders, not just PTSD, although that's a component, but anxiety and depression, addictions, marital issues. So that kind of that holistic look at mental health more generally. And trying to fight this idea, because as first responders, we tend to hold the worst case scenario for ourselves as well. So PTSD, we've kind of onboarded as ours, but it's really trying to normalize that we can have these other things going on too, and we don't have to let them percolate or grow worse until such time where we can have a PTSD diagnosis or something like that. So it's this idea of getting treatment fast, early, quickly, regularly, and so that we don't ever hit that kind of ceiling of the worst case scenario.
So the effect on the family of a first responder is of great interest this weekend at this seminar. What are some of the issues that family members that you deal with as a registered psychotherapist are presenting that have first responders in their families?
Yeah, it runs the whole gamut. So often first responders marry other first responders, so that's always a pretty common one. So then you have the dual kind of experiences happening. But at the same time, I think often spouses of first responders feel like they're kind of, alone in the house a lot of the time, doing the things, keeping those things going while they're off on shift and those pieces. They often feel alone or cut out from conversations. So first responders, not just firefighters, but first responders will often really withhold what goes on in a day for good reason, because they don't want to share with the spouse, but also that kind of starts to bring up this disconnection between communication styles. So we can start to feel withdrawn and distant. And often, especially in first responder culture, we don't want to talk about our emotions or what's going on. So if I run a bad call or I run a bad shift and I come home and I'm pretty upset about that, I can come off maybe as angry or come off as frustrated, and my spouse can feel like, they got to walk on eggshells around me, or they have to be careful, they have to read me coming in the room. And all of these can lead to kind of strain in the relationship and pressures on the relationship in different ways. So it's really looking at the fact that, and something I share and something I would share in the presentations is, we often look at statistics for social workers who work with populations talking about traumas and their burnout rate and their stress rate, which is quite high. But we never look at the statistics of what the burnout rate of being a family member of someone in the first responder world would be. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it. These people aren't there for the hour in the session or whatever the time might be when they're case management. They're there 24/7, running their own life, working with a family member, or working with their kids, for instance, and managing all of those pieces on top of it. And while there is some options to leave, right, often they don't want to, because they want the person that they met and love and were together with at the beginning.
What's your advice to a family member if they're seeing, some behaviors with their loved one that are concerning?
Yeah. Well, it's funny because a lot of the times the spouse is the reason people would come to see me, right? So I get it. It's like, wow, my wife told me to come see you, and they kind of grumble and sit in the chair. So I think that the biggest message for mental health in general, and this would apply to a family member seeing this thing, is early, before you need it, get into the system. So one thing that somebody's going to find the moment they try to activate this system, especially if they're trying to use the public sphere, is the wait times are just crushing, right? So 6 months to a year is not uncommon for publicly funded therapy. So you want to get in early, start that process early. But also in the moment of crisis. So if we're a family member, we're seeing this, or we're a first responder and we're waiting until things are in crisis, now I've got to navigate multiple systems, right? So there's lots of publicly funded first responder specific things. Do I need to do that? Do I need to do this other program? Do I have to talk to my doctor? Do I have to activate WSIB? And all these things take time and consideration, and you don't want to be doing that in a moment of crisis. So I think that the bottom line for anybody, whether it's the first responder themselves or their family member, is we want to start this process before you need it. Get used to phoning the calls, meet the person that you might sit down with, try to find that connection beforehand, and treat mental health like dental health, right? So let's do a preventative function. And if you have to go and spend a little bit of money, if you go privately and, it's, 50 minutes, but I didn't really get too much out of it because I'm not in a crisis. You're building that relationship with this person that you can trust and call. They have a relationship with you, and keeping those pieces up also means that I have an appointment coming up, maybe every 6 months or 8 months or whatever, and I know that if it happens where I do end up needing it, I'm developing some of those skills in those conversations. I'm engaged with somebody already. I have a face to a name. I'm through that awkward kind of meetings of getting to know somebody, and all of that was free from a crisis. So when I am in a crisis, I can skip all of that and get right to the work.
It's good advice. I've got a question it's a burning question for me.
Okay.
There's registered psychotherapists, there's social workers, there's psychologists, there's psychiatrists.
Yeah.
What's the difference? Who should you call?
Right.
For what?
Yeah, good question. And it depends on what you need, right?
Yeah.
So for therapy, you need somebody in the registered field. So you want an RN who's registered with the college, you want an RP who's registered with the College of Registered Psychotherapists, or you want a registered social worker, so somebody registered with those colleges. Registered is actually important now because we have legislation that says that psychotherapy is a protected act. So much like somebody who, maybe like a doctor prescribing medication is a protected act, giving therapy and counseling now is a protected act. So nobody can just decide that they want to do it. They actually have to belong to one of those colleges. So those three are kind of interchangeable outside of some just really kind of minor differences. So an RN, of course, would be a registered nurse. So their background is in nursing, but they can take a mental health stream and become therapists, and under their college, they can provide that therapy. Social work has been the college that everybody knows. It's been around kind of the longest out of all of the mental health colleges. So somebody that's gone through and gotten their MSWs or Masters of Social Work and then registered with the college, again, is what we typically see, or for a long time anyway, saw for therapists. And then RP is the newest designation, so the College of Registered Psychotherapists, just a few years old, and was created when the Act for Psychotherapy was created. So it was the college that kind of came out of that process. So if you're going for talk therapy, those three are your best bet. If you need something more, so a psychologist and a psychiatrist, both are doctors. One's a PhD, the other's a medical doctor first. So a psychologist is somebody with a PhD who can give you a diagnosis. Those other three cannot. And they would typically give you a diagnosis through a ton of assessments. So they give you what they call like a battery of assessments, depending on what's going on. And at the end of that, they would give you a diagnosis. And that diagnosis is as medically binding as your doctor. The difference between a psychologist and then a psychiatrist then is just the ability to prescribe medication. So a psychiatrist is a medical doctor first with special training in mental health, but they can prescribe you medications. Another kind of important distinction between psychology and psychiatry is that psychiatry is covered by OHIP. So if you have the ability to see a psychiatrist, some hospitals, Schedule I hospitals with mental health wings sometimes have that, then you can get a diagnosis and get some medication, sometimes get some follow-up by the doctor, and then of course your OHIP will cover that. Psychologists, while there are some in the public field, are often in the private sector, which means these assessments typically come with a bit of a dollar sign behind them, and that can be a barrier, especially when we think about some of the population of first responders. So firefighting, for instance, 85% are volunteer. So they're rural volunteer departments that are running the majority of fire services that may not be able to afford necessarily these kind of assessments from a psychologist point of view. So trying to get into those streams early. But those are the key differences and main differences of the three. 5.
Thanks. This is an excellent explanation. One more question.
Sure.
You often hear about trauma protocol, trauma modalities, and things like that. And for people that are in their first responder world and they've never really delved into trying to get some of this professional help, those could be pretty scary words.
Sure.
You hear stuff like EMDR, accelerated resolution therapy, exposure therapy, all this type of stuff. What are they?
Yeah. So when we look at trauma, I mean, there's different schools of thought, and that would take quite a long time to think about all of those different ones, right? But there's different schools of thought, generally speaking. So when you're thinking about trauma work, there's some general things you can think about. So when it comes to some trauma work from, let's say, an EMDR, well, EMDR works on some principles and ideas about memory consolidation and how that process might work. And so through bilateral stimulation, that's the big piece in EMDR, they activate this memory consolidation. It allows you to process that memory effectively, going on the premise that a trauma interrupts the process of kind of integrating that memory in that way. And often when we think about trauma, we think about an experience where that process gets stuck. So everything is about helping unstuck that process. So EMDR is that way. Something like cognitive processing therapy is about understanding the core beliefs that are shaken in a trauma and helping you manage those and navigate through those so that, trying to keep this in general terms, is that you can come out with a core belief system that can incorporate the trauma that has also happened, but also effective enough to, really give you a level and balanced view of other people, the world, your future, danger, those types of things. Exposure therapy is other idea about how the body remembers and is triggered by some of the events that have happened. So let's say a trauma occurs at a bus stop, for instance. Bus stops become dangerous in our kind of psychology and our nervous system. So exposure therapy works by the way of replacing that experience of heightened nervous system trauma response with a new response that, again, bus stops become a kind of net neutral in the process. So each one has their own kind of idea about how it works. I think that is telling to the where we are in psychology is we don't have this like one kind of definition of things that rule them all, but that each of those modalities we've mentioned are ones that people have found effective and helpful. And especially in some of the first responder worlds, where, especially when we want some structure, we want to know where we're going, we want to know how to get there, we want to know what to do. Some of those modalities like CPT, exposure therapy, EMDR are all approaches that, they kind of resonate with because it gives them that roadmap.
Well, this is definitely a high-level overview, Nick. It's been a pleasure talking with you. I understand you have a website that's got a lot of this information and references on it. Can you just share that with our audience today?
Yeah, sure. So afterthecall.org, everything on that website is 100% free. So it's just information collected, evidence-based as best as I can make it. And so go on there, browse around. I always tell people questions are encouraged. So you can send me an email, which you can find on there through forms or my email directly. And I'm happy to help where I can.
Thanks very much for talking with us today, Nick.
Thanks, Scott.